Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Succession Planning and the Development of Your High Potentials. My name is Jessica. I'm on the marketing team with BizLibrary, and I'll be the host for today's session. Before we get started, I want to go through just a couple of housekeeping items. First, what you should see on your screen. On the left-hand side of the screen, this is the webinar viewer. So this is where you'll see the content that we're sharing with you today. On the right-hand side of the screen, this is the control panel. So this is where you can join the audio portion of today's webinar, and you can also communicate with us through the question box. The default mode for the control panel is for it to collapse. If you want to open the control panel back up, simply click the orange box with the white arrow in it, and it'll expand for you. All of today's attendees are in listen-only mode. You can join the audio portion of today's webinar either through the teleconference line. You can also listen through your speakers. If you're going to listen through your speakers, I recommend either using a pair of headphones or a headset to get the best audio quality. We like to keep things pretty informal, so if you have any questions or discussion points, feel free to send those over through the question box that's located within the control panel. I like to weave the questions in as it relates to what we're discussing in the webinar, and then I'll also leave some time at the end for Q&A. I am recording the webinar today, so I'll make a link to the webinar recording as well as the slides and follow-up information available on our blog after today's session. So that's bizlibrary.com/bizblog. I also put a link to the slides in the chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen. You should have also received a link to the slides in the reminder email that you received this morning. Today's session has been approved for 1 hour CE credit for all of you HR professionals attending. I'll make a link to the completion certificate available at the end of today's webinar. I'll also send a follow-up email. You'll receive that around 4 p.m. Central Time today. With that follow-up email, you'll receive a link to the completion certificate as well as the slides and the webinar recording. If you'd like more information on certification or recertification, I encourage you to visit hrci.org. Again, my name is Jessica. I'm on the marketing team with BizLibrary, graduated from the University of Missouri, Columbia with a degree in journalism. I've been working in the training and development industry now for about 5 years. I'm very active in social media, so I tweet on behalf of BizLibrary at BizLibrary and also at my own account at Jess L. Petrie. I'm also pretty active on LinkedIn, so I like to share a lot of articles and discussions around human resources, training and development, and marketing. So if you're on either of those social networks, would love it if you'd reach out and connect. Presenting with us today is Chris Osborne. Chris is the VP of Marketing for BizLibrary. Chris has also worked in a consulting capacity with a Paris-based leadership development consulting firm where he helped organizations design and implement leadership and executive development programs. He's been performing learning development and training functions formally since 2000 and informally for organizations since 1987. Prior to Chris's move into the business sector, he practiced law in the areas of labor, employment, and business litigation for over 12 years. He graduated from WashU School of Law with honors in 1987. Chris is also active in social media, so you can find him on Twitter at Chris Osborne STL, and he's also on LinkedIn. So I'm sure you'd love it if you'd reach out and connect as well. Just to give you a little bit of background on BizLibrary, BizLibrary is a leading provider of online employee training and e-learning solutions. The award-winning content library contains more than 7,000 online employee training videos covering every business training topic, so things like communication skills, leadership and management, sales and customer service, compliance and safety training, desktop computer skills, and more. Additionally, BizLibrary's LMS and social learning technology platform help HR and training leaders improve and manage employee learning. All right, so enough about us. I have a quick poll question for today. So you should see it pop up on your screen in just a minute. What's your most pressing concern about your next generation of leaders? Is it A, we haven't identified high potentials, B, there's skill gaps, C, no development plan is in place, D, we don't have the resources to develop leaders, or E, something else?
Hey Jessica, how you doing?
Hey Chris, I'm great. How are you?
Okay, now that I unmuted myself, I was just talking away there for a second.
I figured that was the case, but I thought I'd let you figure it out on your own.
Yeah, not an auspicious beginning to today's webinar when the presenter is so technologically challenged, but So I think our most pressing problem for our current generation of leaders here would be skill gaps, I think. Oh my, what a day, huh?
And that is what's trending so far in the poll.
It is trending. It's sort of like we're watching Twitter in real life here unfold. Yeah, this is Jessica mentioned earlier my background in consulting, and this was one of my favorite areas to work in. We had organizations come in and ask us to work with high potential next generation leaders. They were always the most fun because they hadn't gotten so far into their careers as executives or leaders or managers, whatever the case may be, that a lot of bad habits had sort of taken root. And we always looked at these people as kind of blank slates, a chance to really get them started in that next phase of their career down a good path. So I always loved working with these people at this stage in their career. So it's really fun to see how our audience reacts to this content, and this is an interesting poll question too. So good stuff here to start with.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and close out the poll, share the results with everyone. So it looks like we've got 39% say that skill gaps are the biggest, our most pressing concern. 20% no development plan in place, 16% haven't identified high potentials, 16% no resources, and 8% something else. Again, something else, let us know what that is. Shalita said that it's retaining them long enough to develop them as leaders. So go ahead and share your something else if you'd like to. We always appreciate participation, comments, discussions, other things along that line. And it's really a challenge across the board, I'd say. I mean, as far as the session planning goes, if you look at the across all industries, it's really based on the sheer volume of, boomers we have retiring, and then there's that gap. There's Gen Xers that are a much smaller generation compared to Gen Y that is moving up in the ranks, and the boomers that are moving into retirement. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good point.
All right, cool. I'm going to go ahead, Chris. We have 3 kind of high-level things that we hope people take away from today. So I'm going to pass the slides over to you, and you can run us through those and keep going.
All right. Well, let's make sure that I do this correctly. And I think you see the what we'll hope you'll learn slide. Is that correct?
Yep, we're good to go.
All right. Well, one of the things that Jessica and I, we do these polls at every one of our webinars, and the fact that so many of you identified skill gaps as your most pressing problem is actually very encouraging to me. That means that you have a program in place and you know what your biggest issue is, which is wonderful, wonderful news. So, and actually, that's a great place to be, because if you've got a program in place, you've got your high potentials organized, or you're to the point where you know, okay, we've got issues we have to resolve. That's and when we had organizations in that place, when we used to do this in consulting world, these were like, our home run clients. This is a great place to be. So I think we've got something for everybody, but those of you who identified that as your biggest challenge, I think you're going to enjoy today's webinar a lot, because we've got some really good suggestions, I think, to really get you moving. Those of you who had other answers, I think we've got great content for you today as well, particularly in terms of identifying the high potentials. I've got some, I think, some interesting ideas and discussion points for you on that as well. So I want to talk to you about, what we see as emerging best practices in this space, and it has changed. When I first entered this space, there was sort of a rote way to do it, and that's really been erased. I think there's some emerging, very interesting best practices. We're going to suggest for you a very practical, fairly straightforward model for selecting participants in a program. And I love using models because models can be reproduced fairly easily, and they're scalable and something that people can take, and they're tangible. And then we have another model for determining the target competencies for your program. So quite a bit to cover, but I think there's some real tangible elements in this that at least I hope you're going to find interesting. We're going to start with a quote. Robert Fuller, who's a great thought leader in this space, has a really superb way of looking at this. It's not just succession planning to the top. It's getting the right person in place for every job. Some of tomorrow's key jobs may not even exist now. And this is what I was referring to a few minutes ago when I said that they're sort of the best practices in this space have changed. You know, when I first entered this space, like I said, it was kind of a rote process. You know, we had, you know, the vice president of marketing, so, you know, we're building a pipeline to replace the vice president of marketing when Chris retires. We have the president of the company. We've got to have a pipeline of talent in place to replace Dean when Dean retires. We've got to, and that was what succession planning used to be. And again, there's certainly an element of that that remains important. But there's something else going on in today's marketplace and something else that's happening in our organizations that we need to be aware of. And we need to think differently about tomorrow's leadership needs and leadership challenges. And ultimately, that's what a succession planning approach, a succession planning program needs to take into account. It's succession planning to leadership positions within the organization based upon future needs. So it requires a kind of a different strategic framework and a different strategic approach to things. Now, I'm not saying that you don't need to build bench strength to fill current positions, but we have to have a, you know, add to that, I think, a layer that is really important. And here's some really important trends that are stressful, truthfully, creating some stress for us that are impacting that. There are really broad market forces and trends impacting organizations of every size. You know, people have used an acronym VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, to describe these market forces, and it's really true. We don't know what's going to be happening to us in the next 18 months, 24 months. You know, markets hate uncertainty. We all hate uncertainty, but the world has never been more uncertain, I don't think. We're seeing a new set of competencies beginning to emerge to react to some of this with the demographic changes, the behavior changes, the technology advances. We really don't know what job needs are. We've got some great research on that in just a minute. And with the economic, you know, the Great Recession, you know, all the just layers of jobs that were lost to the economy and the pressure, downward pressure on pay, and now the economy is beginning to bounce back. Organizations are starting to hire. What was predicted was that there was going to be a reduction in employee loyalty, and we're beginning to see that play out. And we're seeing a whole generation of employees enter the workforce that really don't view loyalty, don't define loyalty the same way that people my age defined loyalty when we entered the workforce many, many years ago. So again, not bad, not good. That's the reality of the work world that we face today. So we have to begin to think about things differently. Jessica and I were chatting just before we started today's webinar. And Jessica, you found this research, which by the way, I love. Would you mind explaining what you found? Because I think this is some really important information.
Yeah, so this comes from a survey done by College for America. So basically it's a non-for-profit that links colleges and employment opportunities. So this is a survey they did in 2014, ran from December 16th through 2016 and 2013, so published it in 2014. But what they looked at was a couple of different things. So some of the things they looked at were, you know, developing employees versus hiring new ones. They looked at, you know, what the biggest challenges were to developing employees or moving them to leadership roles, and they also looked at some other things. But most relevant to today's content, I think, is how much they want to develop new employees, but really the biggest hurdle that they face is that there are skill gaps. So really look at it, it's a 2-to-1 margin that employers prefer to develop employees internally. So 73% said, hey, let's develop them. And of that 73%, 41% felt strongly about it. That's for low-level team leaders and middle management roles. And then 27% said hire from the outside. paired that with senior managers and executive roles. So 67% said to go ahead and develop them. 32% out of that 67% felt very strongly about this, and then 33% said hire them rather than develop them internally. And then again, the biggest challenge that they face, or the biggest hurdle, really was that skill gap. So not that different than the webinar attendees that we have with us today. 87% said that employees are missing promotable skills. So there's kind of this disconnect between they want to develop them, but they need something in place to help them get where they need to be. And I wonder what the disconnect is, Chris. What do you think? I mean, between or at least the difference between team leaders and middle management versus senior managers and executives. Why would there be, I mean, it's not a huge difference between the percentage that wants to develop team leaders and middle management versus senior managers and executives, but you think they're just like, hey, we can't develop them, or what?
Oh, excuse me. That's not I don't know that would be a statistically significant difference. There is a bit, excuse me, but there is a bit of a difference. But at the senior level, if you kind of step back and think for just a second, if you look at the left-hand side, team leaders and middle management, those are people that tend to work a little bit more tactically, not so much strategically. The right-hand side of your chart, senior managers and executives tend to be more strategic as opposed to tactical. Organizations, what do they have the biggest trouble with? According to the research coming out of Harvard and John Cotter's group, organizations really struggle hitting strategic goals, don't they? So if you're having trouble hitting strategic goals, what's the change? Is it easier to look within, or maybe we need outside help coming in to help us change strategic direction? So I think that's part of it. I think organizations, they're really looking to make a big strategic shift. They want to bring somebody in from the outside. But use two real public examples, recent public examples, Apple and Yahoo. Apple was in pretty good shape strategically. Great market share, growing market share, innovative products coming out, receptiveness, public receptiveness to their products. So Steve Jobs becomes ill, eventually passes away, but it's a fairly logical progression to promote from within. Tim Cook steps in, it's fairly seamless, but there wasn't the need for a big strategic shakeup there, was there? But then you look at what was going on at Yahoo, and they were really struggling for an identity, for a strategic direction, for something. So they brought in somebody from the outside. That's a pretty extreme example, but I think that explains it. I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but that's how I would look at that. I mean, does that example resonate with you, Jessica? Is that logical?
Yeah, it does resonate. And, Myra poses an interesting rhetorical question. So she says, isn't it odd that we hire people who are not high potential? Don't we as hiring managers believe that from the beginning, all of our hires are high potential? So you wonder, at what point are they not high potential anymore? It's an interesting question to pose.
Yeah, you bring everybody on board, and as a new employee, you think, hey, I can rule the world here. Everybody comes in with that, and as a hiring manager, yeah, if you're not hiring somebody that you think is high potential, why did you bring him in the first place? Great point. Exactly. And we're actually going to talk about that as we get into today's webinar. So, no, good. I would suggest that that's not a rhetorical question, to be honest. What happens? What happens after they come in? What takes them from high potential to not high potential? Something happens. I mean, did we make a bad hire, or did we use the wrong criteria? I mean, I don't think that's a rhetorical question at all. That's a great question. We mentioned earlier, we used that Robert Fuller quote about, some jobs may not exist. This is not a hypothetical. This is not a rhetorical question. We've got actually some wonderful and fascinating data about this. LinkedIn published on their own a fascinating infographic. And Jessica, help me so I make sure I get these numbers right. But they looked at over 270, I want to say it's 270 million LinkedIn profiles to find the largest growth as members self-identified themselves. So this isn't, they didn't impose this on anybody. This is how people self-identify themselves between 2008 and 2013. And here are huge, these are growth areas. And it had the social media intern, 170 times growth in 5 years. The cloud services specialist, huge growth. The data scientist, now I love this one. The Zumba instructor, I still chuckle that I see that you include this in this infographic. But look at this last one, big data architect. There wasn't a single job listing. Not one appeared in 270 million profiles in 2008, but there are 3,400 of them 5 years later. And in our field, Jessica and I both work in marketing here at BizLibrary. I can tell you a digital marketing specialist, digital marketing, inbound marketing, those jobs didn't exist in 2008. And for many organizations, and I'll tell you this is absolutely true here at BizLibrary, those are mission critical job positions here today. What jobs exist in your organization that are critical to your success that didn't exist 5 years ago? Or think about it a different way. What job competencies are mission critical in your organization that you didn't have 5 years ago? I bet you can think of several. But this really illustrates the point we're making, that former sort of linear approach to development and succession planning, we've got to give that up. We have to give that up. So we're seeing these 5 best practices emerge in organizations that have what we would view as sort of best-in-class or top-end succession planning programs. And here they are. They're aligned with organizational strategic objectives. And I'm going to give you a different way of thinking about alignment in just a second. Or if you've been on other webinars, it's not going to be new. But an analysis of current and future capabilities is required with an emphasis, big emphasis on future. It's focused on potential and values. Now that's an interesting focus, isn't it? But it's focused on potential. Again, this is very future-looking, isn't it? It's got to be perceived as relevant and real by the participants. In other words, they have to understand that it's going to help them. And last but not least, our program must drive a culture of continuous learning and development. Now, when I give you the definition that we're going to advocate for alignment, you're going to see that all 5 of these best practices have a very common denominator. There's something that really connects all of these. All right, so let's start by talking about how do we begin even figuring out what we need our organization to do. We're talking about this needs to be aligned with strategic goals, strategic objectives. How do we even figure out what those need to be as we put this succession planning program in place? Jessica mentioned I was a consultant. I worked for many years in that space, and I still love, and we do this here at BizLibrary, we use the old-fashioned SWOT analysis, strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats. This is something I think teams should do, organizations should do, and I honestly think individuals should do this as a way to do strategic planning for our careers, for our teams, for organizations. Strengths and weaknesses, the sort of the yin and the yang, the heads and the tails, opposite sides of what we do well internally. So what do we do well today? What are our weaknesses? What do we do well and why? What do we do poorly and why? But really dive into the why. And for the weaknesses, can we do less of that? For the strengths, can we do more of that? And will our strengths really prepare us for future success? And then the opportunities and threats. This is where, at least for succession planning purposes, we want to spend quite a bit of time, because this is the external stuff. These are, what are our greatest opportunities for growth in the market? Where can we really move our organization in different directions? And are our strengths well aligned to help us take advantage of these opportunities? And if so, great. If not, do our weaknesses stand in the way? And this is where our succession planning can really have an impact. And threats, where are we vulnerable? Are our biggest threats external or internal? Are they market-driven? Are they competition? I mean, there's a whole range of ways to get at this, but this is a really, really important analysis. These are really important questions that we need to be asking ourselves. You're never going to get good answers unless you start asking good questions, and a SWOT analysis is a fantastic way to begin to highlight the questions that are really going to help you get the answers that you need to create this strategic goal alignment. Now, if you look up the term alignment in sort of the standard business literature, particularly in HR, you're going to find a lot of definitions that are going to be a lot of jargon and ultimately, in my view, be more or less meaningless. They're going to tell you, you establish goals and set a strategy and you do. Okay, none of that helps us, in my view, do what's necessary on a day-to-day basis. Because if it's not practical, in my view, it doesn't really help me move my team forward, my organization forward, or if I'm looking at this from a personal perspective, it doesn't help me move my career forward. Think of alignment this way. Alignment is a process of continuous adjustment. We've all seen these viewfinders, okay? You know, you've looked out, and so you get it focused on one thing, and now you want to look at something else, and so you move the viewfinder. What do you have to do? You have to change the focus, right? Because you're now looking at something else. Think about it like your car. You have the front end aligned. You have the car aligned. You take it in, you get it aligned, and then what do you do? Do you sit it still, or do you continue to use it? Well, of course, you drive it, and it gets out of alignment, so you go get it realigned, and you use it. It's a process of continuous use and adjustment and use and adjustment. That's alignment. It's a process where we're continually adjusting what we're doing with an eye towards a specific objective. That is how we do this. This requires executive involvement. We need to know exactly what it is we're trying to do. This gets back to that, you know, what are the questions we're trying to answer, where the SWOT analysis really helps us. Our senior executives are involved. Here's where we're going. Here's why we're going there. And now we're going to measure constantly our progress against that. And our succession planning program fits in here and here. And here are the opportunities that we're going to try to take advantage of. Here are the threats we're addressing. And now we've got an eye towards the future. And our succession planning program is going to help us fill these gaps, take advantage of these opportunities, anticipate and address these threats. Jessica, anything to add to that?
No, Chris, I think we're good to go. I think this next slide outlining the opportunities and threats, I think will help reinforce some of that. But I think you explained it well. Good old alignment definition.
Yeah, I keep this keeps coming up, doesn't it? And I know I sound like I get up on my soapbox on that, but it just makes me nutty when I see, you know, the standard definitions, and they just keep showing up. I keep seeing that same old-fashioned definition, but this is exactly how to think about this. This is your opportunities and threats, and this is where the strategic alignment of a succession planning program fits in. And, you know, really thinking carefully about how to address these questions. These are really great questions to ask. Again, going back to what I said, you're not going to get good answers unless you're asking good questions. And this is a starter. These are good starter questions for you to begin exploring as you begin to kind of put your program together, okay? So once you begin to explore these questions, the next logical question that you have to address is who participates, deciding whom to groom. And by the way, I love this illustration. So who are your keepers, who are your creepers, who you want in there, who participates? And again, having participated in a lot of organizations that face this challenge, there are no right and wrong answers to this, but I will give you, here are 3 high-level strategic approaches that I've seen work really, really well over and over and over again. And it starts, oddly enough, I think, with self-selection. I've seen organizations be incredibly and pleasantly surprised when they have self-selection as the first step in who's going to participate in their high potential programs, their succession planning programs. Ask, okay, we're going to start a high potential program to do the following things, to begin to prepare our next generation of leaders in this organization, and here are the objectives for it, here's what we're attempting to do, here's the strengths of our organization, here's our weaknesses, here's what we see as market opportunities, here's what we see as threats, this is what we're going to attempt to accomplish from the organization's perspective. Who'd like to participate? Lay out the criteria clearly for participation and ask for volunteers. And you may be surprised who will raise their hand and say, you know what, I think I'd like a chance to do that. And you may be pleasantly surprised. You may be surprised at who doesn't raise their hand, people that you thought would be great potential leaders. But you know what? If they are not motivated to lead, they probably never will step up and be the kind of leaders your organization needs to be successful. That's why I think self-selection is such a great way to begin the process. Assessments, I think, are fantastic, and there are millions, well, not millions, but there are dozens and dozens of assessments out there. You just have to find the ones that are actually predictive of success in your organization. I really like ones that are values and behavior driven, so you can line them up with what your organization is attempting to do. Make sure you're assessing along the competencies that you really need for success in those next more complicated roles, and assess career readiness. This is another piece of this that's very important. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But, you know, where are people in their career? And this is where, you know, millennials sometimes don't always have a great deal of self-awareness. Somebody may have been out of college for, you know, 2 months or a year or two, and, hey, I'd like to participate in your, you know, succession planning program to be CEO. Well, okay, but let's talk candidly about the actual requirements for that role. So maybe we do want you in a high potential program, but let's be realistic about what makes sense. So where are they in terms of career readiness? This is another important piece of this. And last but not least, observation. You know, we pay our managers and leaders every single day to make informed judgments based upon what they observe around the organization. This is an appropriate place where observation makes sense, again, to take that into consideration. So I think these three elements, when applied well, applied effectively, with objective standards applied, with good training, with good questions and good answers back and forth, can be very, very effective. Now, career readiness, this is just again, going back to my old consultant days, this is the classic Foursquare about performance. On the vertical axis on the left-hand side, high at the top, low at the bottom, how others rate your performance or individuals' performance. Across the horizontal axis at the bottom, with high at the right, low at the left, this is how individuals assess their own performance. On the upper right, this is where individuals rate themselves highly and others rate themselves highly. These are areas of real strength. Those are easy. That's an easy check mark. These are people that are in, you know, from a career readiness perspective, great. They're in good shape. You know, these are people that are, if they raise their hand, they volunteer, they're probably in a pretty good place. Those are easy. The ones in the lower left-hand quadrant, whole different set of issues and questions that you have to address. But it's the ones in the upper left that I think present interesting challenges, where individuals rate themselves lowly, but others see them doing really, really well. Those are coaching challenges. You need to ask, you may have them in the wrong role. People see them as really valuable, really high potential employees, but you may have them in the wrong role. You got to find out what really motivates them. And where you've got people who rate themselves highly, but others rate themselves lowly, these are also coaching challenges. They probably have blind spots. You need to help them out. So those two quadrants are different challenges. In the upper left, you may have a candidate for participation in the program, but it may be a different type of challenge. But in both of those quadrants, it's a different kind of thing. But ultimately, this is what we're looking for. We're looking for potential. Again, going back, the whole program needs to be future-oriented. We want to understand sort of where we are. And here are 4 traits that if you can find people that exhibit these traits, you are finding individuals who are probably queued up for long-term success as leaders in your organization, regardless of their current role. Again, going back to the idea of somebody that's pretty new, if they exhibit these 4 traits at a pretty good level, you probably do have a high potential employee on your hands that you do want to find a way to put them in a place where they can be challenged and nurtured. Are they curious? Are they naturally curious? Is this something that they exhibit? Okay? And by the way, curiosity is a behavior. It's a trait in a behavior, and people can be, if we model curiosity for them, people can learn to become more curious. Do they exhibit insight? Do they make connections when others don't? Are they engaged? You know, building a succession planning program, getting people involved, this is time-consuming. It takes a lot of energy. It takes effort. We want to make sure that we're really dealing with people who are highly engaged. And if you think about the best leaders, the most valuable leaders across your organization today, I'd be willing to bet good money that they exhibit a high level of engagement. And I love this last one, determination. By the way, I picked these up from an article. It was a big idea article. It was a cover article earlier this year from the Harvard Business Review. But this last trait I really honed in on because I really appreciate this one for a whole range of reasons. But determination, how do people react when there are obstacles put in their way? Do they kind of accept it and sort of just deal with it? Or do they really pound through it and find a way around the obstacle and deal with it and really confront the problem and overcome it? How determined are they in the face of adversity? When you find people that are curious, insightful, engaged, and really determined to succeed, you're really onto something. Those are people that you want to find, keep, nurture, and hang on to. That's a great set of characteristics, I think, that really can help you define potential. But anyway, I really loved that article from Harvard Business Review, but I just loved that perspective on potential. Jessica, actually, I see all of these traits in you in many ways. I don't know if you would describe yourself that way or not, but I would be curious if you see yourself this way.
Yeah, I mean, I would. I mean,
Kind of put you on the spot there a little bit, I know that.
I would probably be blushing because I don't always take compliments well, but yeah, so definitely. I mean, I've always kind of had a natural curiosity, but like you said, Chris, it's something that's developed. It's not something that's always innate in people, and it's not something that's always that's encouraged from employers. So I think sometimes having these traits also depends on the environment that you're working in, or the environment or the team that you're on, or the opportunities that you're given. So you may have that trait, but maybe it's stomped down and you're not given that opportunity. So maybe you want to be curious, but you're constantly being pushed to focus only on things that deliver activity results or some other things. So maybe there's some things that are competing with that. But I think they're definitely traits. I mean, and they're also similar to an emerging competency that we talk about sometimes, Chris, learning agility. So these things are also included in that as a key competency. So they can seem kind of intangible, I know, like saying, okay, so how do we measure curiosity in someone? Or how do we measure insight, engagement, and determination? But like Chris said, there's some key observable behaviors or key situations that employees are in that you could look at and then, see how it works. I mean, some of it could be you could put them on an action job or a project team and see how they adapt and how they work in that situation. So we actually have a couple of good questions, Chris, if now's an okay time with you to take them.
Yeah, if you can hang on for just a second, I want to amplify something that you said, and then I'd be happy to take the questions. I actually paused on this slide for just a moment and spent a little extra time on curiosity, insight, engagement, determination for a reason. When we were in a webinar, I don't know if it was last week or the week before, but we got a little bit of pushback about curiosity. Somebody said, well, you've identified that almost like it's a competency, and it's not really, it's, you know, a character trait. And I disagree with that. And actually, I disagree with it very strenuously. And I think Jessica, I didn't prompt Jessica, by the way. I totally surprised her with this question today. But I guess I know her so well. I kind of knew how she would answer. But she answered it really well. Curiosity absolutely can be fostered and encouraged. It can also be tamped down and squelched. Children, we see this all the time. Children are naturally curious. And one of the big problems with education, formal education, is that sense of natural curiosity gets you know, squashed in people frequently. And we see this around work a lot of time. You see highly creative, very curious people who end up in roles where it's not fostered. And it's heartbreaking to see. And then you see people who are put in roles where their innate sense of curiosity is encouraged and fostered, and all kinds of interesting things begin to happen. No, curiosity can very definitely be encouraged, fostered, and grown when the right environment is in place and you have the right leadership and management in place that understands it, recognizes it, and knows its value. So, Jessica, I'm really happy with the way you answered that question, and so I definitely wanted to spend a second amplifying that a little bit. Okay, let's take those questions.
All right, sounds good. So first question's from Marilyn. So she asked, who defines promotable skills? My generation may define those skills very different from Generation Y.
And I'd be curious about what generation you're talking about there, because that is a really loaded question. Okay, so who defines promotable skills? That is, again, a loaded question, and I don't have a loaded answer for you. I think it is defined by what your organization needs, both today and in the future, for success, based upon the strategic objectives of your organization. So, 5 years ago, marketing. I'm going to use our current professional area, Jessica, as a way to illustrate this. We could use human resources as another example, as an area where Web 2.0 and social media has had a massive impact. But let's use marketing as an example. 5 to 6 years ago, marketing was primarily an outbound exercise, advertising, print ads, radio, TV, events. That's really what was necessary. So there was a whole different set of skills necessary to make that work. The graphic skills were really around graphic arts and illustrations. You know, that was a piece of it. The copy that had to be written was focused on print ads, or, you know, maybe radio, maybe TV, broadcast advertising. That's what marketing was about at the time. In fact, we had an interesting conversation here at Biz Library. A guy came to us, he was wanting to help us do a print ad. He said, well, you guys don't really do any marketing. When we do a ton of marketing, it's just different. He didn't recognize it as marketing, which was what was hilarious. Marketing, the promotable skills in marketing today are radically different. It's about digital, it's about inbound marketing, it's about SEO, it's a completely different world. So I don't know that any person, quote unquote, decides what's promotable. I think it depends upon what the organization needs, and that gets back to that whole illustration earlier we had about those jobs that didn't exist 5 years ago. And I don't know what jobs are going to exist or going to be important in our space in 18 months or 36 months. Think about human resources over the past 7 or 8 years. There was no need to know anything about how to recruit on the web, because those tools didn't exist. LinkedIn didn't exist just a few years ago. Now can you imagine a high-end recruiting function existing without access to social media? So what is that going to look like in another 3 to 5 years? I can't tell you. So I think that's how to think about promotable skills, which gets back to something Jessica mentioned earlier. Learning agility, which gets back to this slide, potential. Curiosity, insight, engagement, determination. The idea that we want people who can learn, people who have demonstrated the ability to acquire new skills, people who have demonstrated the ability to be adaptable, those are people who have potential, and that's promotable. At least that's how I look at it. Marilyn, I know that was a long, really long-winded answer to a really great short question, but I think my honest opinion is that's the best answer. Jessica, do we have another one? And I promise not to go on so long about the next one.
Yep, as long as we can keep it short. Well, this next one's from Sarah. So she asked, should we communicate to our stars that they're part of a succession plan? So are they part of a, should we say they're part of a specific position or just a future leader?
Future leader. Okay, let's go on. That was a little too short, wasn't it? I think you owe it to them to be candid as possible. I'm not a big fan of telling them that you're targeted for this specific position because it's real hard to predict the future, but I do think it's important to communicate to them you're part of the development of a program to build future leaders, okay? All right, so we're looking for potential. So again, a four square. I love these four squares. So here's a great way to kind of think about it. So if you think about the potential on the left and actual performance on the right, because, you know, we want to make sure we're getting people, this is a great way to think about that engagement level, who's really engaged, who's doing well today. So in the upper right-hand quadrant, high performance, high potential, they're doing well and they've got these are the easy people. Those are people you definitely want to participate in the program, okay? But if you've got people in the upper left, they're not performing well, but they appear to have high potential, there's a disconnect somewhere. These are people, again, going back to the comment earlier, well, isn't everybody that we hire high potential, right? So something's misfired. Motivation's off. Maybe there's a disconnect between the employee and the manager. Those are people that I would really love to talk to. So you've got this great potential, but what's not working? Do we have you in the wrong place? Kind of going back to the Tom Peters thing. Do we have the right person on the bus? We just have you in the wrong seat. That's the question that I would ask of people that are in that quadrant. And then in the lower right, these are people that are really performing high, but they don't have great potential. Does that mean that we've got them in exactly the right seat in the bus, and this is the end of this is it. This is their role, okay? And that's fine. That may be fine, but that's a conversation that needs to be had. This is your role. If you're going to stay in this company, this is it. This is where we see you long-term in this organization. And that's one of those courageous conversations that may need to be had just to create a higher sense of self-awareness. Now, and we need people in that role sometimes that just perform really, really well in specific roles. Low performance, low potential, you know, the answer to those people are obvious. We don't, you move them out of the organization. You're looking for people that you can move in other places, all right? So, and all of this leads here. This gets back to what we're looking to do in terms of emerging competencies, where we need people to go, what we're needing them to do. On the left-hand side of this chart, this is sort of a distillation or summary of 5 competencies that are routinely appear in competency models for leaders or executives. And I pulled this together from a webinar I did, a presentation I did for a group up in the Northeast a while back. And I just looked at leadership models or competency models for leaders. The first ones I could find dated back into the early 60s, and this was real common, really common up until just recently. And I found these 5 were really commonly repeated. And there's nothing wrong with these: vision, interpersonal skills, ability to develop others, intelligence, and character. Now, we're not saying that we don't want leaders that are intelligent and have character, but there's an emerging way to think about how these competencies are expressed in a new generation of leaders. These emerging competencies begin to look like this: collaboration, learning agility, that what we talked about earlier, that ability to acquire new skills and apply them in unfamiliar situations, people development, digital literacy. Think about the advances in productivity, efficiency. Almost all of them revolve around digital tools today. Global citizenship, the ability to understand sort of how what you do fits into a broader marketplace. So some emerging competencies beginning to show up that maybe layer on top of these or complement or fit together in some way, shape, or form. But leaders look different today than they used to, which gets to this next piece. So we have to figure out which blend of those competencies fit leaders in our organization, what we need in the future, and begin to explain clearly to participants in our program, our high potentials, our succession planning participants, how participation in this program is going to be relevant to them, to their career, to their situation, and provide the support that they need to develop and learn. It's going to be extremely important. And then I love the way Jessica communicates this to us here. We have to clearly define standards. You know, adults of any age, but millennials especially, and I work with an entire team of millennials. I'm surrounded with them. I tell my wife sometimes I feel like I go to work at kindergarten, and then I get here and I have a great time because these people challenge me and they push me and they make me think differently, and then they do amazing things when I do that basic fundamental thing, when I clearly define standards. When I make it clear to them what they need to do, then I get out of the way and I let them do it. But that's a critical thing. We have to define standards. We have to make it clear to everybody and make it transparent what's going on. Clearly define the standards for participation in the program. Clearly define standards about what's expected of you when you participate in the program. Here's the standards to move forward in the program. Here are the requirements at every step along the way, and here are the competencies that we're going to be asking you to develop and stretch and learn, and here's why these competencies are important. Here's why we see them as important, and here's the strategic fit between these competencies and the future of this organization. Here's a great quote that explains this. Managers need to stretch, challenge, and coach their high potential employees. Without multidimensional dialogue about these issues, managers tend to hold onto their high potential people instead of helping them along an intentional developmental pathway. High potentials may interpret this as a lack of company support and will be inclined to look elsewhere. And that's exactly what we don't want to happen, and that Ron Ashkins even calls this the paradox of high potentials in the Harvard Business Review. It's exactly the message we're not trying to send. So we have to support them. We have to find ways to build their confidence, not tear it down. And you build their confidence by stretching them and challenging them and finding ways to do this, to build a culture where continuous learning becomes part of what we do. And learning cultures are typically characterized by these 5 elements. Holistic thinking. Everybody understands how what they do fits into the broader organization. Learning is integrated into everything that happens in the organization. People are sharing information. We don't work in silos. Everybody's sharing information together. It was an interesting research conducted by Robert Kelly at Carnegie Mellon about knowledge workers, and the weird paradox about knowledge workers is we typically only hold about 6 to 8% of what we need to perform our jobs in our head. Now think about that paradox. Knowledge workers only know about 8% of what we need to do our jobs within our head, which is why these things are so important. We need to be able to think more broadly. We have to have learning then integrated into what we do. We can't work in silos. We have to have a broad capacity for change. We have to be collaborative, and then we have to have a commitment to continuous improvement and learning. That's what defines a learning culture. And in the end, I think that's a pretty good definition of what makes a knowledge worker. So, as we begin to wrap up our session today, another best practice that we see is that succession planning is targeted at leaders at every level of our organization. We need different things at each of these levels, but make sure that you're targeting supervisory and team leads, high potential employees, that we're helping our newly promoted managers. Let's not leave them out of this, that we're helping mid and senior level managers, and of course our executives and directors. And I love this illustration. Thinking about succession planning phases, we've got the consideration, who's participating and why. We let them explore roles, but then they're promoted. And now we've got a transition phase, which is a part of the process, and the adaptation. It's really well explained in this article called A Succession Plan for First-Time Managers. This was published in T&D magazine back in December of 2011. It's a great article. But this chart really lays out sort of that bridge across the time people are promoted and really illustrates why it's so important to keep this going. So we're helping them all the way through the time when they actually really take on that professional adoption of their new role. So here you go. Here are the best practices in succession planning. They're aligned. Our objectives are aligned with the organization's strategic objectives, which means it's a process of continuous adjustment. We do an analysis of current and future capabilities with a big focus on future. It's focused on potential. We have to make sure that participants understand it's relevant and real, and the whole objective at the end is driving a culture of a continuous improvement in learning. All right, Jessica, I'm going to be quiet, turn it back over to you, and I'm going to start looking for more questions.
All right, Chris, sounds good. I think you may have muted yourself or lost audio or something, but continue to send the questions into the chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen. I have a couple of recommended resources for today's attendees. This first one is a business impact course. So these are super interactive courses. So basically it puts you in a situation, presents you with different resources. So things like a video that represents a meeting that you have with another employee, or you have emails and research articles. This one's targeted to managers, so you complete it in about 15 minutes, and it takes you through different strategies about how to maintain employees in key areas. This next course is part of a series on mentoring. So we didn't have a lot of time to talk about it today, but mentoring programs are oftentimes really important components of succession planning programs. So this series, I think it's a 6-course series, I believe, takes you through how to create a mentoring program. So it's really great, and it can be really important, almost like a piggyback off of this webinar. And we only have an hour slot. So if you want to try out any of the resources that I recommended, they're all included in the BizLibrary collection. So that's more than 7,000 e-learning and video courses over 25 different topic areas, and it's set up to where your employees get unlimited access. So you're welcome to try out the courses that I recommended or any of the other courses that are included in the collection. Just let me know. I'll leave a poll up through the question period, and you can do a free 30-day trial.
Yeah, good stuff.
All right, great. So Chris, this next question comes from Tim. So are you determining potential before or after assessing? If before, how are you determining the potential? Is that where you're looking for motivation, curiosity, etc.?
Well, I think you have to keep an open mind first, but I think this is where you kind of go back to those 3 things about participation. You ask for volunteers, sort of self-identified people, then assessments, and then observation. And I don't think you want to put those on a timeline. It's this, then this, then this. I think they all work in conjunction together. So self-identified people, and it's those folks that you use the assessments with. But the observation is a piece of it. So for instance, let's just say hypothetically you've got somebody who does not self-identify as wanting to participate, but through observation, through the manager or multiple managers say, hey, you know what, Jessica would be a really great participant. Did she raise her hand to participate? No, she didn't volunteer. Well, why don't we talk to her? Let's see if let's find out why she didn't. And so in sitting down and talking to that employee, you find out, well, I just didn't think that it was something that I was eligible. Well, why don't you participate? Let's have you take part in the assessments and just kind of see where you are in terms of the program. And if it seems like a good fit, let's get you in. Okay, great. So it doesn't have to be a linear thing, and this is where the observation becomes so important. I think making sure that your managers, your leaders around the organization know how to recognize those 4 traits can really help you get out ahead of that a little bit. And then you can apply the assessments to track, identify those competencies that are important. So I think that can be a really good way to get there.
All right, next question's from Amy. So how do we get senior leadership to employ the self-select option first? My management team only selects people who are nominated by others for their career development programs. How can we convince them to open up the idea of self-selecting?
Well, it's the reason that a lot of organizations are reluctant to do the self-selection is they think everybody's going to want to be a participant. And as long as, this goes back to what we talked about earlier about making sure that the standards in criteria are clearly stated. They're transparent. Everybody knows what it takes to be a participant in the program. As long as you make it clear to the organization, to senior leadership, that look, it's not going to be open to everybody, that you have to be at this level in your career, that your career has to include these credentials, and you have to have done these things, and you maybe have to have participated in these training courses and gotten through this much of, then it becomes a lot easier to include the self-selection as a piece of the program. You end up with the piece of it that works better. So I don't think there's any harm in allowing the self-selection. And then what can happen is, let's say somebody self-selects, but they're not really ready. Your assessments show that they're not ready, and they haven't completed the training. That's a great conversation to have. Hey, look, here's where the assessment came out on this competency. You're a little light here. So here are 5 training courses that'll help get you there. So apply next year. Here's where you are in your career. We needed 5 years of experience in this. You're at 4. Next year you'll be there. Then you got to participate in these 2 training classes and complete this program. So now you have coaching opportunities, and you can see that commitment to get through this, the determination, and you get a chance to see people exhibit those behaviors that help prove that they've got the potential.
All right, so we have one more quick question, and then I'll wrap up. So this question's from Teresa. So what's the platform or process for allowing employees to self-select?
That's a great question, and there's no uniform answer. However you allow employees to communicate with you would be the way I would do it. Either privately through managers, that's one great way to do it, email through HR, or on a community chat board if you want to do it publicly. But I wouldn't put any limitations on it. Just make sure that the criteria is quite transparent and clear, and then open it up to however employees want to do it. That's how I would recommend it.
All right, great questions. For those of you that are attending for HRCI credit, I put a link to the certificate in the chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Just a reminder, I'll also send out a follow-up email that you'll receive around 4 p.m. Central Time today. That includes a link to the webinar recording and the certificate as well. We hold these webinars every week. They are free to attend. They're also HRCI approved, so I hope you'll consider joining us for a future session. Webinars coming up next week, one on learning content strategies and one on closing the skills gaps. So I hope you'll consider joining us. All the webinars are on our website at bizlibrary.com/webinars. And again, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for all the great questions and participation. And thanks, Chris, for presenting with us as well.
Yeah, thank you all very much for participating. We really appreciate it and hope to see you in a webinar in the future.